Hey, what's up everybody, this is Meath24, and today I'm taking a look at the Resident Evil Damnation CGI movie. This is a follow-up to Resident Evil Degeneration, which came out a few years back, and follows Leon S. Kennedy once again. Claire Redfield is not in this film at all. It's almost entirely about Leon and these freedom fighters in this former Soviet bloc Eastern European country. Ada Wong does show up as sort of a supporting character, but it's mostly about Leon and the freedom fighters. And it's set somewhere between RE4 and RE6, and I forget specifically when RE6 takes place, but this film is stated to be taking place in the Resident Evil universe in 2011, so I believe that would put it after RE5, I'm not positive. I forget exactly what year the games take place in the fiction, but it does build off of the previously established plot points from the games, which I really appreciate with these films. Even though Degeneration was sort of just an alright film, I appreciate the fact that it ties in directly to the game lore as opposed to live-action films, which just kind of do their own thing. And I know a lot of people are far more critical of the live-action films as a result, because they're just sort of going off on their own fantastical little adventure there. That said, this film feels a little bit more focused than Degeneration was. Instead of kind of juggling a few different plot points there and bring it all to a head at the end and sort of trying to up the ante the whole time with how big scale the threat gets to be. This one, it's pretty obvious from the outset what we're dealing with. Leon gets thrown into this war zone. As I mentioned, it's an old Eastern Bloc European nation, and after separating from the Soviet Union, after it kind of fell apart there, there's a number of political movements that sort of upset the status quo in the country and results in basically the military and the government versus the people. And it's a small country, so it's not like there's a lot of destruction, but obviously it's enough that they want to try and contain it on both ends. Basically, the freedom fighters want to overthrow this government that's sort of abandoned them to a certain degree, and obviously the government wants to quell the freedom fighters to, make themselves look more stable as a nation and a more contributing member to the bigger global sphere there. And so what ends up happening is Leon sent him because they found out that intelligence has basically told them, the BSAA has told them that these freedom fighters now have their hands on some B.O.W.s, which is obviously not good. It's kind of become the typical routine for the Resident Evil stuff since they made the shift more towards the action, in that Resident Evil 5, we had people with B.O.W.s in Africa. Resident Evil 6, we had military organizations with B.O.W.s, again, in Eastern Europe, kind of with Chris's campaign there. And even in Resident Evil Revelations, we had Veltro using some similar B.O.W.s. And so it's sort of the typical routine now with Resident Evil getting to a much bigger scale. With the older games, it was more, here's a mansion, here's Raccoon City, this backwater backwater areas of America that are kind of self-contained, but obviously you get bigger and you have to go into a much broader, more global scale there. So I do appreciate the fact, though, that it is contained exclusively to this little nation, to the one particular city that they're in, actually. And that's I think, a smart move. It doesn't try to get too big for its boots, so to speak. Similarly, the enemies are relatively contained. The Licker here on the front, and there's a variant of the Tyrant that we see later on. Both harken back to the old games in the series, and I think it's a really cool combination to use because the Lickers are definitely the more prominent of those two enemies, but they're an enemy that I think doesn't get to see enough use in the games nowadays, at least. They showed up briefly in RE5, but it was sort of a different version of the Lickers, and so here it's the classic RE2 Licker where it's got the brain exposed on the top and the long whip-like tongue, and you got the big raptor claws on its hands. And it's always been, I think, one of my favorite designs of enemies in the Resident Evil universe, because it's so weird and creepy looking, but yet it's super lethal and just sort of intimidating overall. They're decently big, and that's kind of cool. They also use those in tandem with the Plagas from RE4 and RE5, and the way that the Plagas behave is kind of somewhere in between RE4 and RE5. RE4's Plagas were sort of a hive mind mentality where Sadler could control them and have the local Ganados do his bidding. Whereas RE5, they explained that there was sort of an advancement of combining the Plagas with the progenitor virus to, if I remember right, it was to give the what was it, the Magini? Was that what they were called? They're basically the African equivalent of the Ganados, where they had a little bit more tactical advantage, had a little bit more intelligence to them, even though they were still very much a group of infected, not unlike the zombies that came before them. And so they sort of play off that in that some of these freedom fighters will deliberately inject themselves with the Plagas as sort of a control Plagas, and then inject the lickers with the what do you call them? Like the subservient Plagas that will bend them to their will, basically. So you have like one person who is commanding one or more of these lickers and using them as a more tactical B.O.W. approach than most, because a lot of times they'll be like, oh, these terrorists got their hands on B.O.W.s, and now they're just going to let them run loose and wreck everything. In this case, they have a little bit more of a plan ahead of time, which is great. I think it makes the story more interesting, it makes the combat more exciting, and definitely gives it, I think, a more intelligent scripting overall, because it's not like these are just freedom fighters who are blowing stuff up for the sake of they don't like the government. They have a plan in mind, which is cool. There's a couple parts where they show that the lickers are being housed in the back of these delivery trucks, and so they get to certain stop points, and all the trucks are marked by a certain logo, and so when they get to the point, you know the lickers are going to jump out and start attacking the soldiers. But there's also sort of a gamble with that, because even if someone infects himself with the host, or the commanding Plagas, the higher one that gives them control over the lickers, eventually they are going to turn themselves into one of the infected, and so it's sort of a matter of time before they turn into one of the mindless infected themselves. So it's not a perfect trump card there. And Leon mentions at one point that the only way to remove the Plagas, given their situation, is because those whatever versions of Plagas they're dealing with here attach themselves to the spine. Basically means that even if you try and remove the thing, you're at best going to end up paralyzed. At worst, you're just going to die. So there are definitely some big stakes at play here. I appreciate the fact that this cast is relatively limited as well. I mentioned that Leon and a small group of freedom fighters are kind of the main cast there. There's also the president in charge of the nation is a relatively major player in the story, and we can see her in the spotlight quite a bit. Ada has a little bit smaller role, and so does one of the sort of advisors to the president of this nation. But really, that's the main cast. You know, you have like 6 or so characters, maybe 7. Hunnigan does show up briefly at the very beginning, just sort of set the stage of, oh yeah, Leon's still working with Hunnigan. Okay, this is before RE6, but after RE4. Good, understand that and everything. And I think the dialogue is, for the most part, written pretty well in this. I'm not positive, but it seems like the audio and the animation is synced up a lot better in this one for the dub than it was in Regeneration. And it almost seems to me like they actually did the English version first, and then maybe the Japanese version. I didn't watch any of the Japanese audio on this one, so maybe it's just that they kind of did the animation a little bit different for both versions. But when I was watching the English version, it seemed like the lips synced up really well with this. The detail in the environments is insane in this. Like, I'm always impressed with some of these CGI films, these anime films, where it's fully rendered CGI stuff, even if it's a tie into another property or it's something completely different, where there's just a crazy amount of detail. And even though there's some pretty dark environments in this, they still look super good. I think the dull glow of like green and orange lightings helps a lot in sort of setting the tone of this being a Resident Evil property, but you can still see sort of the grime and grease in these underground tunnels and sort of the bunkers that they've got and stuff like that, so that's really cool. I definitely feel like this has more of an action tone than some of the games do, but it does sort of harken back to the video game source by having a shift to first person every once in a while, which I know some people are not a fan of in films. I know what the Doom movie did that, which I've never actually seen the Doom movie, I've just seen trailers for it, and some people were not so hot on that. But here it does it sparingly, and when it's doing it, it's more Leon with the flashlight on his scope, kind of looking around, say a parking lot or some underground trench tunnels or whatever. And so I think it works well for sort of reminding us that, yes, this is a horror property. This is a sort of a thriller spin on this. And to that end, it does definitely feel like RE4 in sort of the tone and the setting that it has, as well as the general aesthetic. But I think overall the direction the story takes is definitely more action-oriented, which is fine for a film, I think. At this point, we kind of know what all these enemies are capable of. There's no real surprises here. With that in mind, if you were looking for something completely brand new from Resident Evil, you're not going to find that here. But what I do think you'll find is that Leon's still as entertaining as ever as a lead protagonist, and he's grown a little bit since RE4, obviously. Some of the quips that he throws out are generally pretty funny, and Ada's still got that whole mysterious air about her, but obviously she's got her kung fu moves and all that to dish out at people if they need a good whooping, if you will. The Freedom Fighters, the main guy here on the front, he's entertaining enough. There's nothing like super in-depth they cover about him. They kind of give his general story, and then, that's all you really need for an hour and a half film, or hour and 40 minutes, whatever. There's another guy that they meet, that actually Leon spends more time with, who's kind of this dorky goofball guy who thinks he's way cooler than he actually is. Tries to play the part of this, kind of punky tough guy, but he's just sort of a goober and is obsessed with Leon being from America and thinks that's just radical. I don't know. He was entertaining. I don't know if he was meant to be entertaining in the way that he was, but it was one of those things where it's this character is so silly that I kind of like him, even though he's not nearly as well, I think, fleshed out or as believable a character as the rest of the cast. And obviously with something like Resident Evil, the believability factor only goes to a certain point because the games are known for being kind of ridiculous and over the top at some points. But I think this is a little bit more grounded entry in the series. I mentioned with when I did my review on my blog of Resident Evil Revelations, that was a little bit more of a grounded story as well, even though you've got the cruise ships and this kind of crazy setting with all these sort of sea monster designs and all that on the enemies, that the story was a little bit more grounded, a little bit more single-minded in its focus. And that's sort of the thing you get here, is it's a very single-minded story. It knows where it's going, and it knows where it's going to end. It doesn't try and pull too many punches just because I think it's written with the idea that if you are familiar with RE4 and you're planning to play RE6, because this came out right around the same time as RE6 did, if you played RE4 and RE6, you pretty much have an idea of what you're jumping into with this. But that said, it's also, story-wise, more of an RE4 feel to it. A little less horror, a little bit more action. So if you were looking for something super scary, you're really not going to find that here. If you're looking for something that's more just sort of gross and creepy, there's a little bit of that, but not a ton. It's more about Leon being a cool guy and fighting these B.O.W.s and this sort of political conspiracy in this nation. But I certainly enjoyed it. I think it's pretty well done tie-in for a series like Resident Evil. And so that's pretty much it for this review, and with that, I will see you guys next time.